Braden Molhoek is a CTNS program associate, a lecturer in science, technology, and ethics at the GTU, and an adjunct lecturer in the School of Engineering at Santa Clara University, the GTU associate. As an undergraduate, he studied genetics and religion as a double major. He went on to obtain a PhD from the GTU in ethics and social theory. His interests include the science and theology dialogue, specifically how science shapes both theological anthropology, gene editing, and human enhancement, and transhumanism, AI, and virtue ethics. It's a lot. Some of his recent publications include Student Mental Health, Job Concerns, and Issues in Academic Publishing, Stifling the Acquisition of Virtue, and the Possible Perpetuation of Injustice in the Pursuit of Science, and Raising the Virtuous Bar, the Underlying Issues of Genetic Moral Enhancement in Our Journal of Theology and Science. Some of his recent presentations have included, quote, Negative Freedom and Procreative Beneficence, Framing the Kind of Enhancements that Ought to be Pursued at the Second Annual Christian Transhumanist Association Conference, and, quote, ETI and Christianity, Amalgamating, Incarnation and Justice at the 2018 annual meeting of the AAR. It's a great pleasure to welcome Braden Molhoek.
Thank you, Bob, for that introduction, and thanks, Adam, for a very interesting paper to read. Adam and I were neighbors and colleagues here at the GTU and continue to be friends, so I feel grateful to be able to have something to say. Hopefully we can have some interesting dialogue. So, quick outline. I'm going to hopefully talk about 4 things. I'm going to be unfair and say that his understanding of planetarity is both too large and too small. And then I'm going to try and build on what he says about amalgamating vocation to say, what does vocation require of us? In terms of what can we talk about is the refractive action that humans are called to. And related to that then is how do we talk about shaping meaningful human existence. So in his explication of astrobiology, Pryor states that there are, quote, at least 4 habitability requirements that need to be considered for understanding how the universe might harbor life beyond Earth. 1, the availability of a liquid solvent. 2, the existence of a corresponding chemistry. 3, an energy source for metabolism. And 4, the consideration of the breadth at which these other requirements pertain. It is my understanding that from this discussion, it is from this discussion that Pryor develops his planetarity perspective. Living beings, systems, and habitability are bound together through intra-actions. What exactly constitutes an intra-action is at the heart of my first response. Although Pryor admits that the 4th requirement, the breadth of habitability in general, can vary from a moon to a region of a planet or a moon to an entire planet, it is my understanding that he sees the habitability of Earth as constituting the entire surface of the planet. I contend that this can only be the case once the level of human interaction reaches a global scale. To provide an argument why this was not always the case, I turn to an example of an isolated hominid species, Homo floresiensis. Homo floresiensis is believed to have migrated from Africa to the Indonesian island of Flores 1 million years ago, perhaps diverging from either Homo erectus or Homo habilis. The last known remains or tools that can be linked to Homo floresiensis are from 50,000 to 60,000 years ago, with the remains of modern humans in the same caves going as far back as 46,000 years ago. It is not clear whether or not the 2 species interacted, or whether modern humans led to the extinction of floresiensis, but assuming that their extinction did predate the arrival of modern humans, I posit that their existence in general raises questions about the nature of planetarity. Once their ancestors arrived at Flores, their evolution was shaped by an isolated island life. In such instances, organisms can grow substantially larger than they had been or diminish in size, which is what happened with Homo floresiensis. The remains that have been found show that they were only 3.5 feet tall. This kind of evolutionary change means that it was highly unlikely that the population left the island after settling. Therefore, I would argue that the intra-action that floresiensis was capable of at that point in time was very different than other hominid species. They interacted with the island and perhaps the systems of islands nearby, but this is hardly the same as a planet-wide interaction. Perhaps for later generations, the island was all that was known, and it became like a planet to them. But this is very different from planetarity, in my view. This is what I mean by planetarity can seem too big for specific situations or time. It is assumed that life originated here on Earth in the oceans, assuming that life evolved here and not through panspermia. And this means that there was a time in which land was not in the equation in terms of what constituted habitability. Perhaps that's not that significant given how much of the planet is covered by water, but I do think it has implications for astrobiology. As a species, we have to remember how short our history is, both in comparison to life on this planet and to life as a whole and the history of the universe, which Parr does a fine job in addressing. The key then is to look for the possibility of life elsewhere in the universe that encompasses all of the past possibilities of life on Earth. To not do this would narrow the astrobiological search prematurely. So planetarity as too small. While there are particular circumstances where I think planetarity is too large scale for the level of interactions that beings are capable of, I also believe that the opposite is true. That perhaps even fundamentally, planetarity is too small or insufficient for the scope of habitability. In my view, the planet as the scope of habitability is too small first because it leaves out one of the other requirements of habitability. The energy source that is used for metabolism is absent if the focus is on the planet. Even though many species are not autotrophic and therefore are unable to transform sunlight into chemical energy, they are, at least at some level, dependent on organisms that do convert light into ATP. It is virtually a certainty, then, that the earliest forms of life relied on the sun as a source for energy. In the search for life elsewhere, it is not simply Earth-like planets that are the focus, but Earth-like planets that are in a habitable zone, where the existence of liquid water is possible. I would argue, then, that it is an interaction there that relates the planet or moon to the energy source, and therefore this interaction must be constitutive of what we consider the breadth of habitability. Recent news, though still not peer-reviewed, and at this time only about 2 weeks old, and so still unverified, raises questions about the scope of what actually contributes to habitability. Within the past 2 weeks, a research team uploaded a paper claiming to have found the first evidence of a non-terrestrial protein found on this meteorite ACFER 086, which was found in Algeria in 1990, but it's only recently that researchers have found what they identify as a protein that they call hemolythin. It's comprised primarily of the amino acid glycine, with atoms of iron, lithium, and oxygen at each of the ends. A structure that has not previously been found on Earth. Based on the structure of those ends, scholars speculate that the protein would have been able to break water into its component parts of oxygen and hydrogen, which could provide energy for chemical reactions. Part of what makes hemolythin appear to be non-terrestrial as well is the ratio of the hydrogen atoms in the molecule to its isotope deuterium. This ratio is not similar to anything currently found on Earth, but is similar in composition to that of comets found in the Oort cloud on the edge of our solar system. This finding does not change our understanding of how life formed on Earth, but it does provide an insight as to how life could develop in general. If a comet or meteorite were to transfer amino acids, sugars, or even proteins to a moon or planet, it could seed that world with some of the conditions necessary for the development of life and or the chemistry or biochemistry needed for it. The scientific term for this process is a hypothesis known as panspermia. Elements required for life, or even perhaps simple life itself, such as bacteria that survive in extreme conditions, could have formed elsewhere and later transferred to an environment that allows for life to develop or continue to evolve. If such a thing is possible, it again raises the question of whether planetarity is too small. Comets and meteors are not part of a moon or a planet, but they are things that come into contact with these bodies. In other words, planetary bodies have interactions with other objects in space, particularly ones whose orbits intersect with theirs. Therefore, might it not make sense to extend the notion of planetarity to include objects that could potentially contribute to the creation, growth, or evolution of the chemical building blocks of life, or even simple microbial life itself? Location. So in his discussion of Imago Dei, Pryor says that as bearing the image of God, quote, we refract the creative power of the divine in existence, bending and changing this power so that new ways of meaningful existence become available in creation. It's the second half of this phrase that I want to focus on, because I think the implications not only for astrobiology, but for the discussion of gene editing and transhumanism are important as well. One of the earliest concerns that came up in space exploration was the issue of contamination. Would humans bring something to other planets that could potentially contaminate? Or would they bring back samples that could contaminate our own biological system? So, even in science fiction, Star Trek spoke of the prime directive to not interfere with the development of less sentient species. My argument, though, is that what I hear from Adam is a call to image God in a positive way, an obligation to interact with the possibility of life, or even its enhancement. While he might use language of feedback systems, I'm going to fall on more classical ethics language. And to say that if we look at ethical principles, a safer, more hands-off approach might be to invoke the principle of non-maleficence. Humans go to explore, to learn, but we don't interfere. We do no harm. But it sounds like that is not what Pryor is calling for. It seems that he is calling for beneficence, to actively help the possibility of life wherever it is found. If humans are to find new ways for meaningful existence to be available to creation, I argue that this means getting involved in the evolution of life wherever it is found. The question becomes exactly how involved humans have to become in this process. Meaningful existence likely requires a sense of agency, self-transcendence, where an organism has an understanding of both self and other. Given how few species we know are capable of this, I would posit that it is a stringent requirement of action that humans would need to foster in life elsewhere in the universe to allow for the evolution of self-consciousness. So how do we also talk about this in terms of shaping meaningful human existence? If humans are called to this kind of action for life in general, but not only on Earth, Pryor's understanding of Imago Dei vocation lead me to believe that these obligations might also exist between current humans. Julian Savulescu, an Australian philosopher at Oxford, who posits that humans might have a strong obligation towards their offspring, speaks of the principle of what he calls procreative beneficence, the obligation to bring about the best possible children. Does the refraction of the image of God require a human to have such obligation towards future generations? If so, then gene editing and human enhancement will become much more prevalent, including germline modification, forever altering the biological aspect of what it means to be human. Of course, the obvious question is, what constitutes human modification that acts as a refraction of God's creative power? Using the frame of non-maleficence versus beneficence, it might be possible to try and identify priorities as to which kinds of human genetic modification might be more in line with divine intent. Typically, transhumanists or those advocating for genetic modification or enhancement build their argument on a negative definition of freedom or liberty. It is my body and my genes. Why should anyone tell me what I cannot do, especially if my choices do not harm others? This is where non-maleficence plays a role. But to truly follow that argument, that the criteria for choosing modifications should be tied to avoiding harming others, the result would be less than satisfactory for most transhumanists than I would imagine they would like. Increasing one's speed or strength, for example, would not be allowed because such changes would increase one's ability to harm others. Even increasing intelligence might not be allowed because people with greater intellect may find ways to manipulate or take advantage of others. The kinds of changes that would be allowed would likely be restricted to aesthetic choices, things that allow for greater sense of self-expression, perhaps holographic hair. The other problem with these kinds of enhancements is that they do not seem to contribute much, if anything, to the furthering of meaningful existence of life. From a divine frame of love, though, it could certainly be seen as creative. The principle of beneficence, on the other hand, would seem to prioritize enhancements that are more in line with making life meaningful, curing disease, restoring the function of limbs, and generally making people healthier, are changes that both help people and make a difference in their lives. Unlike modification driven by personal freedom, these kinds of modifications or enhancements are driven by a desire to help, to heal. The one example I have yet to cover, however, is radical life extension, or theoretical biological immortality. While this could be seen as an extension of improving life, I would ultimately argue that Pryor would see this as counter to the refraction of the creative power of the divine, creating a positive feedback of population overgrowth. And it would cause humans to move beyond their current planet, which is something that I feel like in his text Pryor said, human action has been tied to Earth. But given that within the next 5 billion years, Earth will no longer be habitable, either because the sun will evaporate all the water on it as it expands, or it will expand to cover the entirety of Earth. If this is the planetary future of life, is it not inevitable that humans need to loosen their interactions with Earth and to find new places? Thank you again for this opportunity to engage in some meaningful conversation.
That was a heck of an invitation there, Bob. Braden, I should clearly keep you as my neighbor, and that would clearly strengthen some of the pieces that I'm arguing. So you got 4 critiques and slash friendly amendments. Some of them are less critiquey. But I'll go. I'm gonna try and knock them out, and I'll do it in 5 minutes. Right. So the first one is interaction, right? That my notion of planetarity ends up being a little bit too big in order to account for these sort of particular instances with Homo florensis. And I think you're right. And what I would say is, I would just say that Homo florensis doesn't have a planetary notion of habitability. It only has an instantaneous notion of habitability. And that the concept of planetary habitability can be then applied at various scales of complexity of living things. So for instance, small bacteria already would have a notion of planetarity, even though Homo florensis doesn't. Right? So this is the interaction piece where there are overlapping units in terms of the significant ontology that may not neatly fit together. The argument that planetarity is too small is absolutely fair. And probably the only thing that I can say is that I just didn't address panspermia here. And if you take panspermia as a theory very seriously, then yes, you need to be more cognizant than I was of how it is that you're describing planetary habitability. To my credit, I'd say, like in the case of like something like Enceladus, right, where we're talking about gravitational vibrations creating the tension in the center of that moon in order to generate the metabolic energy stream. There's an example of where that could fit in terms of how you're describing it. So I don't think that one is necessarily problematic, but it would require reshaping sort of how those descriptions occur. For vocation, we're going to need to just have a longer conversation about beneficence and non-maleficence, because I have a feeling we probably just disagree, and that's okay. But I'm still the last one is the critique that I thought was most interesting. I'm going to put a sharper point on it than you did, because I think you were being kind. I think you're really asking, does my notion of the Imago Dei lead to eugenics? I think that's logical. I think that's the logical sort of place where that argument is going, and I think that is a deep critique worth taking very seriously. It's also related to this issue of how beneficence and non-maleficence are sort of playing out in the ethical ramifications of what it's chosen to act on. In principle, I don't think it has to. However, I don't think that there's any framework that I've put in place that would prevent it from being used that way. And so I think that's an interesting place to sort of say that there's an angle that needs to be developed out of this that I'd be very curious to talk about. Okay, that was close to 5 minutes.